British general election, whatever the outcome, has been one of the most unpredictable and surprising in recent years. The Conservatives, led by Theresa May, called the snap election when they had a 20% lead in the polls. Labour, led by Jeremy Corbyn, was languishing at close to 25%. Just on the brink of the election, the gap has narrowed to single figures, and one poll has put Labour at 40% of the vote. How can this have happened? After all, as the senior BBC anchor David Dimbleby has said, Corbyn has hardly had a fair deal at the hands of the press. The bias against Corbyn is a long story. In 2015, the BBC's Tory reporter Nick Robinson said he was shocked at the anti-Corbyn bias in the media. Later, the Media Reform Coalition studied the BBC's coverage of the Labour leadership coup in June 2016 and, as Business Insider reports, found that the supposedly impartial broadcaster had given twice as much airtime to Corbyn critics as to his supporters, while also noting the pejorative tone of BBC reports about Corbyn. The BBC's political editor Laura Kuenssberg had been found by the BBC Trust to have seriously misrepresented Corbyn's opposition to shoot-to-kill policies, depicting it as an answer to whether he would be happy for police to pull the trigger in the event of a Paris-style attack. This sort of media landscape is custom-made for Conservative dominance, and the Conservatives' PR man Lynton Crosby is well known for his ability to manipulate that terrain. Crosby's key tactic in this election was to find a wedge issue that would separate a chunk of Labour voters from the Labour leadership, and to keep hammering away at it. For the Tories, the major wedge issue in this election was to insinuate links between Jeremy Corbyn, a supporter of a united Ireland, and the IRA. And journalists were all too happy to be fed their lines. The BBC, the supposedly impartial public broadcaster, was very much a part of this. Andrew Neil, in a typically hardball interview with Corbyn, asserted,
"Isn't the truth is that you've basically supported the armed struggle for a united Ireland, but now you want to be Prime Minister, you have to distance yourself from it?"
Remarkably, there isn't a scintilla of evidence for this claim in any of the many attack pieces on Corbyn. Neil also confronted Corbyn with allegations made by someone named Sean O'Callaghan, whom he said was an ex-IRA man, and who claimed that Corbyn had never supported peace in Ireland. This story was taken wholesale from The Sun. The Sun had been screaming most loudly about the supposed IRA links, and in the early hours of the morning after the Manchester bombing, it ran a story accusing Corbyn of having blood on his hands. And this was linked to a feature inside the paper in which O'Callaghan claimed that Corbyn made it easier for those who planted bombs. Neither The Sun nor Andrew Neil saw fit to explain that O'Callaghan was, by his own account, an informer working for Irish Special Branch, with a record of wild claims, including the smear published in The Telegraph but repudiated by a House of Commons inquiry, that murdered Catholic lawyer Pat Finucane was an IRA man. Not a credible witness, in other words. The Telegraph contributed to the furore with an exclusive story reporting that MI5 had opened file on Jeremy Corbyn amid concerns over his IRA links. The piece never explained what these links were, but did show that MI5 had opened files on many left-wing politicians and infiltrated anti-racist groups. One of the most extraordinary lines of attack on Corbyn was that, as the BBC reported, he refused to single out the IRA for condemnation, instead insisting that all bombing is wrong, including that carried out by loyalists and in connection with the British government. By implication, Corbyn's refusal to apply a double standard and to let loyalist killers responsible for most of the civilian deaths and troubles off the hook meant he was in league with terrorists. Yet, if the subject is terrorism, Theresa May was Home Secretary when MI6 was helping British people who wanted to fight Gaddafi to travel to Libya. These included Salman Abedi, who then linked up with ISIS. Only Peter Oborne, writing for the Rightwing Daily Mail, has brought this up. This tactful silence contrasts with the treatment of Corbyn when, some days after the Manchester massacre, he criticised the war on terror as counterproductive. Corbyn's point was so obvious that it had even been expressed by the former head of MI5, Stella Rimington, and even The Observer, generally hostile to Corbyn, admitted that his point was undeniable. But being right wasn't good enough. Corbyn has always blamed Britain first, said The Spectator. The Tories claimed that Corbyn justified terrorism by saying what he did. The Sun confidently predicted that Corbyn would spark outrage. The Independent pathetically suggested that though Corbyn was absolutely right, it was an error of judgment to raise it so soon. And yet opinion polls soon showed that a majority of the public agreed with Corbyn, despite the demonisation campaign, precisely over the issue of terrorism. And in spite of hours of broadcast coverage and acres of newsprint poring over the details of Corbyn's affiliations in the 80s and 90s, early polling began to show an improvement for Labour. This was especially linked to its manifesto launch. Labour's manifesto, polling showed, was very popular. As The Independent reported, voters overwhelmingly backed policies set out in Labour's leaked manifesto, including nationalising the railways. But the Liberal media was determined not to be too impressed. Andrew Grieve, a senior journalist at The Independent, insisted that, though popular, the manifesto didn't matter. This election was about trust. The long shopping list of policies looked like the manifesto of a party that knows it has no hope of power. Meanwhile, The Guardian concurred. Its achievement is to expand the limits of the thinkable in British politics. Its weakness is that it does too little to make the thinkable seem realistic and practical. This lack of realism and detail theme was ironic, given that Labour had actually costed its policies while the Conservatives hadn't costed theirs. But it was repeated by BBC journalists such as Nick Robinson, who tweeted that Corbyn's manifesto was long on passion and short on details, story of his life. BBC journalists' official Twitter accounts are subject to the same impartiality guidelines as the BBC itself, and he was harshly criticised by some journalists. Gareth Davies of the Bureau of Investigative Journalism asked, "Is this an appropriate tweet for a prominent BBC journalist?" Robinson denied that he meant anything pejorative. If the centre and Liberal media tended to deride Corbyn's supposed lack of realism, the right-wing press pushed the panic button. The Daily Star, a red-top tabloid owned by a right-wing press baron and pornographer, Richard Desmond, ran a story about the manifesto which was entirely based on Conservative claims. The headline blared, "Revealed! Labour's plans to treble council tax, plunging people into negative equity." It claimed that Labour's plans to replace council tax with a new land value tax would treble the tax burden on ordinary working families. This was pure nonsense. A land value tax would hugely shift the burden of taxation towards, as The Independent put it, wealthy property barons, with most people getting a cut. What is more, it is supported by such bastions of middle-class self-interest as the Adam Smith Institute. Only the traditionally left-wing music magazine NME was enthusiastic about the manifesto, gushing about the massive and brilliant things in Labour's manifesto. When Labour's popular manifesto contributed to a surge in the party's poll standing, many newspapers were confused. The Guardian reported, "Pollsters puzzle over Labour's surge." It was always going to be the case, one news article opined, that the polls would narrow during the course of the campaign as Labour's policies received greater media exposure, but the YouGov poll implies that public opinion is more volatile. Nonetheless, its editorial confidently put the surge down to a wobble and warned Corbyn supporters, "Mrs May's supremacy at the start of the campaign will not be easily overturned. Polling volatility should not be overinterpreted." Polling in an election is volatile, and the Tories are still likely to win. However, the scale of Labour's improvement is far bigger than a wobble would suggest. And this is not to say that there was no acknowledgement of Corbyn's successes, or of the extraordinary collapse of May's campaign, which was hard to miss. For example, Corbyn's performance in the debate show The Battle for Number 10 was applauded even by opponents. Even the arch-Blairite and Telegraph writer Dan Hodges concluded, "Corbyn had the cigars out at the end there, breezed through." ITV's Robert Peston noted the seductive power of Corbyn's astonishing good humour even when under attack from Jeremy Paxman. Ironically, it was journalists who had been most hostile to Corbyn's poll ratings and media performance who were most petty about his improvement. Jonathan Freedland, The Guardian's liberal attack pup, had excoriated Corbyn when Labour was doing poorly in the polls. "No more excuses," he said. "Jeremy Corbyn is to blame for this meltdown. But with Labour climbing in the polls and Corbyn turning in a good performance, Friedland and his Blairite colleague Martin Kettle agreed that the debate only showed that the country would like to elect a good Labour government if it could get one. This faction of punditry, mean and small-minded, will probably never change, and yet it moves. Shortly after the television debate, a Tory source told the Daily Mail, "We fully expect to fall behind Labour in a poll in the coming days. It will happen." And whether or not that happens, something that previously only happened within the Labour Party is now happening, at least in part, within the country. A socialist is defying the odds and gaining popularity and ground in the face of a right wing that is much more fragile than it had appeared to be, and even beginning to thrive on the hostility of the established media. And if that makes the British media panic, well, they should, because every inch gained for Corbyn and the Labour Party now is a defeat for them.